Hey folks, welcome to video number 16. This time we're tackling the Great Depression and the New Deal, subtitled Debt Holes, Dust Bowls, and Hobos, because this was a desperate time in the United States with a lot of environmental consequences and a lot of financial consequences that forever changed the United States. So let's get going. So we know of the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties because so many businesses did really well and things seemed to be going great. But even though things seemed to be going great, a lot of people actually struggled during the 1920s. And several key industries struggled. Railroads struggled, the textiles industry, steel, mining, and lumber. And all of the people working for these giant companies really struggled. Wages dropped, productivity dropped. There's a drop in sales of things like automobiles and houses. Farmers also were struggling during the 1920s. They were crushed by debt, and there were very low crop prices, so they weren't making a lot of money after the end of World War I. And they weren't getting any help from the federal government, so they were really struggling. One of the problems was there had been an overbuying of goods and stocks on credit. People had just been buying things without real money. They'd been taking out loans and using early credit and planning on paying things back later. The same thing went with the stock market. People were doing what is called buying on the margin. That means they would make a small down payment to buy stocks and then borrow the rest of the money to pay for the rest. And they figured, hey, once the stock prices went up, they would take that money and pay back what they were making. But when the stock prices stayed down, things got bad. There was also uneven income distribution. The top 1% of earners in the United States saw their income increase by 75%, but overall, people in the United States only saw their income increase by 9%, and not everybody saw their income increase. So here's a sign that would advertise buying things on credit, much today, like you can use a credit card or take out loans, rent to own, things like that. Buy today and pay later. So what happened when the Great Depression finally set in and people knew it was happening? Well, this began around 1929. September of 1929, prices on the stock market peaked and they began to fall. And then came Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. There were a record 16.4 million shares of stock that were sold or dumped. People just got rid of them. Borrowers who'd borrowed money to buy stock, they are left in massive financial debt, and many people were wiped out. They went from being rich in the morning to being flat broke in the afternoon. Over the next 4 years, 90,000 businesses are going to go bankrupt. With banks, 11,000 out of the 25,000 banks that existed in the United States at the time were going to be closed by 1933. There's going to be massive unemployment. In 1929, 3% of the United States were unemployed. That's 1.6 million. 4 years later, 1933, 13 million, or 25% of the population were going to be unemployed. And we didn't help ourselves by passing things like the Hawley-Smoot tariff. This is going to decrease world trade and hurt the economy even more. So what was life like during the Great Depression? Well, a lot of people went broke and a lot of people lost their homes. And so you see these shanty towns, what become nicknamed Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who was president at the start of the Great Depression, started popping up in cities, and this is where the homeless would congregate and build homes out of whatever they could. You would see long bread lines that would form outside of soup kitchens. 400,000 farmers would lose their farms, and things would get even worse in the Great Prairies where a lot of farmers were located. The land became known as the Dust Bowl because the farmland was idle. It wasn't being used. There also was a massive drought during this time, and that meant that nothing was growing. There was no grass that could, or crops that could hold the dirt together, and so these windstorms would come along and they would pick up the dust and just blow it everywhere. Literally, dust ended up in Europe. From the American plains. So people in these areas became nicknamed as Okies and Arkies, Oklahoma, Arkansas nicknames, and many of them fled to California to try and find a better life. Many men struggled to find work, and some just gave up and became drifters or hobos, and just tried to go wherever they could to find a meal or find some kind of work, even if it was just temporary. Women and children often suffered silently and out of sight, just trying to get by. And as you can imagine, this type of poverty had major psychological and physical consequences. It was even harder on African Americans and Latinos because they were already dealing with high unemployment and poverty when the Depression hit. So this makes it worse because what jobs that become available often went to whites first. So here's a photo of one of these Hoovervilles. This one is just in the Pacific Northwest, just outside of Portland, I believe. You can see those little shanties just made of whatever was around. Here's another example of what one of these Hoovervilles would have looked like, a home in them. Here's a photo of one of the dust storms that took place during the Dust Bowl. And here's a group of the Okies or Arkies who were packing up what they had and heading to California and hoping to find a better life. And many towns would post up these signs to warn people not to bother coming in because there were no jobs. They had no resources. So President Herbert Hoover, who was quite accomplished before he became president, is in office when the Great Depression hits. And he preached an idea known as rugged individualism, that it was best for people to succeed through their own efforts and not because somebody else is doing the work for them. So he pushed for public works programs, indirect government aid. He didn't just want to hand money to people directly. So some of these programs that he pushed for were construction of the Boulder, later called the Hoover Dam. He pushed for the creation of a federal farm board to try and help raise crop prices so that farmers can make more money. And he pushed for something called the Reconstruction Financial Corporation, which would loan $2 billion to banks, insurance companies, railroads, and other businesses in order for those groups to give them to people as loans or as payment. And this had some impact, but it wasn't helping everybody. It had some limitations. And so Hoover's reputation became really damaged. And then finally, in 1932, he really hurt himself with his response to the Bonus Army. This was a group of World War I veterans who marched on D.C. to demand help from Congress, but they ended up being driven away violently. Hoover did not intend for it to happen that way, but that's just how it played out, and so his reputation was incredibly damaged, irreparably damaged as president from that point on. Here's a picture of Herbert Hoover. The guy had an incredible life. Besides the Great Depression. He was a millionaire by the time he was 30. He had been orphaned at a young age, had been an engineer, and had a very long and very successful life and career. But his reputation was forever tarnished by the Great Depression. So the election of 1932 comes along. Hoover is running again, but he's running against a guy named Franklin Roosevelt, a distant nephew of Theodore Roosevelt, who had also been president. So FDR is nominated by the Democrats, and Hoover basically didn't have a chance. Roosevelt had been a popular governor of New York, a former assistant secretary of the Navy, cousin of former President Roosevelt, and he'd been stricken by polio when he was in his late 20s, when usually it was a childhood disease. And this left his lower body virtually useless. But this was a well-kept secret. People knew he'd been ill, but he hid it very well. And it seemed like he had made a full recovery. So while he's running for president, he calls for a new deal for the American people to increase the government's role in fighting the Depression. And these promises of this new deal led to his easy defeat of Hoover. And the Democrats gained an overwhelming majority in the House and the Senate. However, FDR would have to wait for 4 months before he's inaugurated, and in those 4 months, the Depression actually got worse. So here's some election buttons that you would have seen in this campaign, one for Hoover on the left and one of FDR on the right. So Roosevelt finally comes into office, and he gets to work right away. So the first 100 days of his time in office are called, well, not surprisingly, the 100 days from March 9th to June 16th, 1933. And during this time period, we're going to see a large number of bills passed as part of the New Deal. And the goals of these bills were to provide one of what are called the 3 R's: relief, which was immediate help for people and businesses; recovery, which were temporary measures to jumpstart the economic cycle and consumer demand, get people buying goods again, get businesses producing again; and reform. These would be permanent changes to our infrastructure, to our financial structures, to prevent future depressions. And FDR reached out to the people directly to explain what these bills were via something known as fireside chats. He would get on the radio and presumably be talking to you as you sat by your fire, listening, and he would be sitting presumably by his fireplace, even though he was usually at his desk with a bunch of microphones in his face. And these were very popular, wildly popular, and he delivered over 30 of them by 1945, which was his last year in office. So here's a political cartoon that kind of catches this spirit of reform, where Congress and all these bills are coming to make a difference. And notice that FDR is running in this photo, when in real life he was confined to a wheelchair much of the time. So what were some of these acts? Well, they were nicknamed an alphabet soup of New Deal acts. You understand why. There were ones like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, not to be confused with the NRA, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the National Youth Administration, or the NYA, the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Social Security Act, or the SSA, the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA, the Federal Housing Authority, or the FHA. Whew! And these are just a few of the many acts that were passed. Now we're going to take a closer look at these in class, so I'm not going to give you too many details here because you're going to be researching some of these and comparing and contrasting and ultimately choosing a champion of the New Deal. So even though FDR had been overwhelmingly supported and elected to office, along with the Democrats who supported the New Deal, there were lots of critics and opponents. A lot of this opposition came because of the idea of deficit spending. That meant the government was creating massive debt. And this was based on some economic theories promoted by a guy named John Maynard Keynes. So they were known as Keynesian economics. The idea was that the government will spend money and go into debt, but then once the economy recovers and people are making money, businesses are making money, then things will balance out and they'll basically pay off the debt that they went into. But certain people disliked this expanded role of government in industry and agriculture. In fact, the Supreme Court struck down several of the programs part of the New Deal. So the NIRA and the AAA that was supposed to help farmers were struck down by the Supreme Court. Although the New Deal would later, FDR would present new versions of the bill that would be upheld by the court. FDR was not a fan, though, of the Supreme Court at the time, and in fact he suggested court packing or adding justices who would support New Deal programs. FDR faced a lot of backlash and criticism for this idea, even by New Deal loyalists and supporters. But ultimately he did have opportunities to appoint Supreme Court justices who considered the New Deal in more favorable and constitutional terms. Some of the more well-known critics of the New Deal and FDR, Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest who hosted a radio show that was critical of the New Deal. There's also the American Liberty League, a coalition of business leaders who criticized New Deal policies. Dr. Francis Townsend was a critic, but he also proposed an idea of monthly income for the elderly, which in many ways was similar to the Social Security Act. And then there was Huey Long, former governor of Louisiana and a senator, who promoted a Share Our Wealth program where the richest Americans would be taxed and that money would be given to the poorest Americans. So here is a political cartoon. You can see this is one that would be critical of all the spending of the New Deal, portraying as a roller, as a steamroller, just blazing a trail forward without any brakes. And this is a cartoon critical of FDR and his view of the Supreme Court, punching through the Constitution into the Supreme Court. So yeah, a lot of people were not fans of that idea. So, a little more behind the scenes of what was going on during the Great Depression and the New Deal, looking at certain groups that are often overlooked. First of all, with women. So a lot of women saw hope and representation through the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. She traveled widely across the United States to encourage support for the New Deal and also pushed for civil rights and women's rights, which at this time were very controversial. But she was the First Lady. She was very confident, so was very outspoken about these. She also wrote a regular newspaper column, which made people feel more in touch with the First Family. There was also Frances Perkins. She was the first woman to serve in the executive cabinet. She was the Secretary of Labor. She pushed for new labor laws and a Social Security program. And she was inspired in large part by something she had witnessed when she was a young woman in New York City. And that was the Triangle Factory fire. She had actually been there and seen the women jumping out of the factory and was inspired to do a lot to change working situations in the United States. With African Americans, you had a group nicknamed the Black Cabinet. These were African Americans who advised FDR on matters critical to African Americans. And one of the most prominent of these was a woman, Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a lifelong educator and helped lead the National Youth Administration to try and find opportunities for African Americans and youth in the New Deal. Now, during this time period, there was actually little done for civil rights because Roosevelt worried that he would upset Southern Democrats and he needed their support for New Deal legislation. So he would pay lip service to civil rights, but never actually pushed for any serious change. Native Americans, in the meantime, they actually saw a big shift. In fact, something that was nicknamed the New Deal for American Indians under the Indian Reorganization Act, which basically repealed the Dawes Act and moved Native Americans from assimilation to autonomy, giving them more say in their way of life. Here's a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt visiting a coal mine, really in touch with folks. And here's another picture of Eleanor Roosevelt right in the middle, along with Mary McLeod Bethune, who is to the left, to our left of Eleanor Roosevelt. So, how effective was the New Deal? Did it end the Great Depression? Well, let's look at the evidence. So by 1937, spending on the New Deal programs was reduced. As soon as that happens, unemployment goes back up and production goes down. So conditions were still better than before, but the New Deal was not a permanent fix. In fact, the Great Depression would last until World War II, when the United States, because of production for the war, would pull itself out of the Great Depression. Nevertheless, the New Deal did alleviate a lot of the suffering, a lot of the impoverished conditions that millions of Americans were experiencing. So some of the lasting effects too, ever since this time we've seen a greater expanded role for the government when it comes to the economy and regulation of businesses. We also see expanded rights of labor. Labor unions have more protections and rights. You also have programs like Social Security for the elderly and other groups that are introduced and are still around and used by millions of Americans to this day. You're also going to see expanded government involvement in environmental issues like conservation that we still see to this day. So this was a wild time. We're going to look at it more closely in class, but thanks for watching, and next video, we'll get into World War II.